This afternoon, you're going to be meeting with the Minister of Indigenous Relations, Richard Feehan. Tell us about what will happen during that meeting.
Jeremy, in addition to meeting with the Minister of Indigenous Relations, we're also meeting with the Minister of Children's Services, Minister Larrabee.
Right.
And basically what's on the agenda is obviously what's really pertinent in Alberta and across Canada is the atrocities of the 60 Scoop and the impacts that it's caused in our Indigenous communities, whether that be First Nation, Métis, and Inuit. And a couple of weeks ago, we went to the legislature where 60 Scoop was on the agenda during question period. And the Aboriginal Affairs critic for the Wild Rose Party raised some issues and some concerns that we, the 60 Scoop survivors in Alberta, had. And in particular, what was basically, he posed questions to both the Premier and as well as the Minister of Indigenous Relations. Some of the things that we have experienced as young people and are still experiencing as adults, and looking at the Premier to actually issue an apology to all the survivors of the 60 Scoop. That was quickly followed up. When I got home that day, I got a call from the Minister of Indigenous Relations, the Honourable Richard Feehan, and we discussed, what needed to happen from that day forward, which has resulted in this meeting that we have today at 4 o'clock at the legislature with the ministers. And we're going to be talking about looking at developing a model of consultation in drafting an apology. There's actually not a draft in progress as of yet. So we're going to be looking at developing a consultation model because we really need to be inclusive of as many survivors in the province of Alberta and actually putting together that apology so that we can take ownership for it, and because that's our apology. And what we're trying to avoid is that government moving forward with an agenda and putting together an apology that's government-driven agenda, and that's what we're trying not to see happen.
For those that are not familiar with the 60 Scoops, the younger generation, tell us what it is.
The 60 Scoop is in 1965. The federal government mandated the provincial government to go into the reserves across Canada and just literally scoop or apprehend thousands of children across Canada. Some of them for no apparent real reason. The caseworkers or the social workers, a lot of them weren't educated in the Indigenous culture. So when they came onto the reserve, they thought that we were living in poverty. Some of the homes didn't have fridges or outdoor plumbing or even electricity. So there was a lot that was scooped up just by what they called neglect alone. And of course, there was also some that, due to the residential school impact, where we believe that we are a follow-up of that era. And so the parents from the residential school, they had no parenting skills. They were actually brought up and raised by nuns and priests that didn't parent themselves. So the children that came out of these residential schools had no parenting skills at all. So it was mostly the grandparents that would take and nurture and look after these children. The caseworkers came in and seen that and quickly apprehended a lot of the children as well too. Some of these children were apprehended across Canada and moved from province to province. Some of them were moved into the States and even internationally as well too, like even in New Zealand and Europe as well. So a lot of the children that were apprehended were impacted by the abandonment issue, right? And so they also faced a lot of abuse, all types, sexually, physically, emotionally, psychologically. And so they were just damaged goods as well too. So when they grew up, which Adam and I are now adults of the 60 Scoop era, that there is a lot of displacement still. We still face abandonment issues. We still face lack of trust within the system. And a lot of us are frightened to this day that our children or our grandchildren will still be apprehended. So while most Canadians are looking at retirement at almost like at our age, we're still fighting for our children that are in care, or trying to help out families to make sure that our children or our grandchildren do not go into care.
Can you guys share your personal experiences with us?
Yeah, Jeremy, I was born in 1964, and I come from the Piikani First Nation, and my community is in southern Alberta, about 2 hours south of Calgary, and it's along Highway 3 between Pincher Creek and Fort Macleod. And I was born in 1964, and I don't really have too much recollection, when I was first born, as much as many of us really don't remember those times. But what I've been told by people that were in contact with me is that I was actually apprehended and scooped out of my community when I was an infant. And I went through numerous non-Indigenous foster homes, as well as non-Indigenous children's shelters, right up until the age of 17. And it wasn't just one particular home. It was probably about 6 or 7 different homes, as well as children's shelters. And it was a very, very tumultuous time for myself. During those times, I did experience a lot of abandonment, loss of identity, loss of community, and even today, as a 52-year-old man, I can't even speak my own language. I'm not fluent in my Blackfoot language in southern Alberta, and I really feel that as a huge, huge, tremendous loss that I've had to cope with as an adult, because I can't even go home and I can't even converse with my own community members and my elders in my native tongue, and I feel that that's a very, very significant loss. And as an adult today, all these things that really happened to me, they've really affected me day to day in my adult life, where it's really caused problems with any kind of relationships that I've had, whether they be platonic or intimate. And it seems like I'm a type of person that's always crisis oriented. Because that's what I grew up with. That's what I'm familiar with. I'm familiar with, the hurt and the pain, and I've kind of carried that into my adult life. And the thing is it's led me down a path that I'm not proud of. I got into alcohol and drug abuse quite heavily, looking for ways to be accepted by my community, because when I came home to my community at 17, it was culture shock. I went from a non-Indigenous middle-class family to all of a sudden be plopped right in the middle of my community, and it was culture shock. And I don't wish that upon anybody, to have to go through what I had to go through. And it led me, to being on the streets in Vancouver on the east side on Hastings. As an adult, I saw the cycle continue to repeat itself, where my own 2 oldest daughters got apprehended by the Child Welfare Services in the province of British Columbia, and they were in non-Indigenous foster homes for probably about 18 months until I was able to get my life together. So, that's my story, and it's a tough one, but I've made a lot of changes to become the person that I am today.
Sharon?
I was born in 1968 in Turtleford, Saskatchewan. I originally registered through the Thunderchild First Nation, and but I was living in Little Pine First Nation, which is my dad's reserve, and that's where my older sister and my younger sister and I were apprehended. And I do believe I was around 2 when we first started getting apprehended, and then finally apprehended at the age of 5. I was adopted out to a half German and half Scottish family, and went to live in the outskirts of Saskatoon, all Caucasian community, and grew up from there with, like Adam said, loss of identity, lack of self-esteem. I felt shame of who I was, and I was shameful for my Cree heritage. I lost my language, and to this day I cannot speak fluent Cree, but I do pick up words from here and there, due to the fact that prior to being apprehended at the age of 5, my final apprehension, I spoke very fluent Cree and hardly any English at all. So I did have a lot of abandonment issues and lack of trust as well too. like most adoptees and fosterees through the 60 Scoop, I did turn to alcohol and drugs as well too. And that was a very shameful time in my life, but I overcame that time. I did reconnect with my family when I was 16, and I learned that I was treaty status with my sister. And my older sister Hilda was she was the oldest in the family, and her two grew up in foster care in Regina. So when she graduated, she went to go work for the Indian Northern Affairs Canada in North Battleford, and she worked with the registry clerk by chance, hoping that our files would one day go through her hands. And sure enough, when I was 16, my sister was 18, we did fill out our application forms for our treaty status, and by miracles and maybe even a divine intervention, our files went right through her hands, and that's how she found us.
Wow.
Yeah, so it was a very shameful time but my adopted dad was a very kind, loving man, and he always told us to be proud of who we were. And it was a really hard time to at that time to be proud of who we were, because we didn't even see another Native person for years, and we had no knowledge of the culture. All we knew that from stereotype thoughts were that Natives were drunks and amount to nothing, and so I was very ashamed of being Native myself. But we started going to a school called Native Survival School in Saskatoon, which is called Oskayak now. And that's where we actually started finding our heritage. We learned how to smudge, and the powerful feeling of the drum as well too. We just embraced that, and so we haven't turned back ever since. We've been just marching on, moving forward, and trying to get as much knowledge about the Indigenous culture that we lost during those entire years. And there's going to be some times in my life where it's just a regression that we'll go back, sometimes triggered and whatnot, but by the power of prayer, as well as knowing that I have my own children and my grandchildren out there, that I promised myself that I would never ever allow them to see the inside of child welfare, and I've kept that promise to this day.
How does the survivor of the 60 Scoop get closure from this?
I think when you think of closure, I don't know if there is ever a time when you'll have complete closure, because of the atrocities that occurred, and it was almost like cultural genocide. When the Premier of Manitoba stood up in the legislature in the province of Manitoba a couple of years ago and made an official apology to all the survivors in the province of Manitoba, he referred to it as cultural genocide. And the effects of the 60 Scoop, it stays with us, probably until the day that we die. But as far as the healing process, that really starts with, an apology. And an apology is an admission of taking responsibility for a wrong and trying to make it right. And that's where healing begins. And when I think back to that day when I listened to Premier Selinger's apology in Manitoba, it was a very emotional day for me. But it was also very heartening to see one of our leaders in Canada stand up and say, "I'm sorry." And that's what really needs to happen in Alberta. Our Premier, Rachel Notley, needs to stand up and acknowledge that it was a dark day in Alberta's history, and publicly acknowledge that, and say that that she's sorry, and then from that day forward, we can move forward in developing some kind of reconciliation plan that all survivors can be partake in and begin that healing journey. But it starts with an apology. I'm sorry.
Adam and I were invited to the in Ottawa early part of March this year, and it was through we were actually invited through the Legacy of Hope Foundation and the National Indigenous Survivors of the Child Welfare Network. We were invited to go share our stories, and we were videotaped as well. And so what this initiative was to happen was our stories will be archived in Ottawa, but before that, there will be an exhibition traveling across Canada in each different city, and so people are able to come in and listen to our stories and what we went through when we were in care or in adopted out. And so everybody has a story to share, and that's also another way to heal. I've heard so many stories of horrendous stories of what people went through, and I feel for them. So we're hoping that more people will come out and share their stories as well too, that because that's also a sense of healing, is when you're able to share your story, then you're being heard. And this is what our intention is with this apology as well too, that we're finally being heard. And it's about time somebody stands up and says, I'm sorry. And that way we're recognized that this dark day in history will never, ever happen again. So with today's meeting, it will extend to an apology. We're not sure exactly the dates, but we're hoping that when Alberta does apologize to the 60 Scoop survivors, that this will set precedents and have a ripple effect across Canada.